we've talked about medieval armor a lot on this channel. This video, however, aims to highlight the main misconceptions about armor in a concise format, skipping long introductions and rambling explanations. The first misconception we'll address isn't particularly outrageous but is deeply ingrained. The thing is, for most people, the image of a knight is tied to full plate armor, also known as white armor. However, it's important to understand that these protective suits became widespread only in the late 14th to early 15th centuries during the late Middle Ages. This period is quite aptly called the Golden Autumn of Chivalry by Arthur Ferguson. By the time plate armor emerged, knights were already on their way to becoming relics of history. If we take the 8th century as the starting point for the knightly class, plate armor was used for only about 20% of their history. For most of the Middle Ages, chainmail was the primary type of armor in Europe. The second misconception, arguably the most popular one, concerns the weight of plate armor. Nowadays, with many museums sharing details of their collections online and reenactors creating replicas of nearly everything imaginable, the myths have subsided. But back in the day, you'd often hear wild claims of armor weighing 70, 80, or even 100 kilograms. In reality, most combat plate armor weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms. The weight was distributed evenly, making it far more comfortable than, say, carrying a 30-kilogram backpack. It's worth noting that modern American soldier gear can exceed 34 kilograms while the Russian Ratnik kit weighs over 20 kilograms. It's also essential to remember that knights didn't have to march long distances. They were mounted warriors, and their horses carried both them and their gear. They fought on horseback as well. By the way, a knight's sword typically weighed less than 1.5 kilograms, while a Kalashnikov rifle weighs over 3 kilograms. It's worth mentioning that the heaviest suits of armor were tournament ones, but those were more sporting equipment than battlefield gear. The third misconception is one I used to believe myself: the idea that knights wore chainmail under their breastplates. In practice, they wore padded gambesons under plate armor, with chainmail sometimes used to cover vulnerable, articulated areas. I couldn't find any real information about the use of a chainmail plate sandwich. The fourth misconception is also quite common: the belief that people in armor were clumsy and immobile. In reality, that's not entirely true. Wearing armor does require good physical fitness, but it doesn't drastically reduce agility. Additionally, most of the weight is carried on the hips, so arm movements remain largely unaffected. And that's crucial for mounted knights who primarily rely on their arms and shoulders in combat. With proper training, a person in plate armor can climb onto a horse unassisted, run long distances, perform acrobatic maneuvers, or even scale cliffs. The fifth misconception is that it's extremely difficult to put on full plate armor without help, or to perform basic tasks like answering nature's call while wearing it. While I've come across medieval sayings along the lines of "better to stink in armor than smell like flowers in a grave," the YouTube channel World of Armor clearly demonstrated that not only can you put on armor by yourself, but, well, let's just say some things are better seen than explained. The sixth misconception comes from modern movies and games. It's the idea that steel armor's counterpart was lightweight, comfortable leather armor. But in reality, soft, single-layer leather provides little to no protection. Authentic leather armor was made from hardened, layered leather which wasn't lighter than steel and offered no real advantage in mobility. Such armor was mainly used in the East. In Europe, there's little evidence of leather armor being used on any significant scale. The seventh misconception: all the armor and chainmail in museums is tiny, which means knights must have been very short. The average height of people during the Middle Ages is a complicated topic. On one hand, it's widely believed that people were much shorter back then. But the more you look into it, the more conflicting the information becomes. Humanity has undoubtedly grown taller over the last century, but knights, as far as we can tell, weren't exceptionally short and would likely blend into a modern crowd without much notice. When examining plate armor and chainmail in museums, there are a few details to keep in mind. First, the armor that survives to this day is often not battle armor, but adolescent or training sets. These were typically stored in castles and passed down through generations, which contributed to their preservation. The second detail concerns chainmail. Chainmail rings have a certain amount of flexibility, so when chainmail is lying flat on a table or hanging on a rack, it often looks smaller than it really is. Once worn, the rings stretch out, covering a larger area of the body. Eighth misconception: armor primarily protects against accidental glancing blows. This isn't entirely wrong if we're talking about armor in general, but plate armor could withstand direct strikes from many types of melee weapons. Piercing a breastplate or helmet with a sword or axe was an extremely difficult task. Even if the armor was breached, it didn't guarantee a severe injury. Plate armor provided solid protection, and it was often more likely for an exhausted or downed knight to be killed by a dagger thrust into the joints of the armor rather than by a sword or axe strike. This brings us to the 9th misconception. It goes like this. Since English longbowmen decimated the flower of French knighthood during the 100 Years' War, their arrows must have pierced plate armor. However, an arrow shot from an English longbow couldn't penetrate a high-quality breastplate 1.5 to 2 millimeters thick, or a proper helmet. That said, during the early 15th century, not all French knights had access to top-tier armor. Some historians also argue quite reasonably that English longbows were primarily used to kill horses rather than knights. Take the Battle of Agincourt, for instance. English archers exhausted their entire supply of arrows on the French cavalry and then engaged in hand-to-hand combat alongside their own knights for nearly 3 hours. Looking at an earlier conflict like the Battle of Poitiers, it's important to remember that it took place in the mid-14th century, before the advent of full plate armor. And as for crossbows, they weren't a guaranteed solution either. Most replicas of crossbows failed to penetrate good quality breastplates. But here's the catch. Medieval plate armor was made from metal, comparable to modern mid-grade tool steel. Still, it's hard to say how consistent the protection was, or whether some areas of the plates were weaker. 10th misconception. Plate armor, like the knightly class itself, was rendered obsolete by firearms. The earliest use of firearms in Europe dates back to the 1320s, long before plate armor even existed. In fact, handheld firearms and full plate armor were more or less contemporaries. But firearms weren't directly responsible for the decline of knighthood. The fall of knighthood was driven by societal changes, the centralization of power, the rise of cities, the shift toward capitalist economies, and the development of professional standing armies. Plate armor actually outlasted knights, being used by mercenaries like riders and elite cavalry such as hussars. In the early modern era, firearms certainly impacted the popularity of armor, not just because they were effective, but because it was far cheaper to arm 1,000 peasants with muskets than to equip 100 or 200 fighters with high-quality protective gear. All in all, it's clear that armor, especially full plate, was an incredibly effective means of protection in the Middle Ages, giving its wearer a significant advantage.